is intensifying on President Biden. Democratic leaders, including former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, have all reportedly expressed concern to Biden over his chances at winning in November, and they're also apparently concerned that he could drag Democrats down with him. Now, some observers have suggested that Biden could drop out as the Democratic nominee as early as this weekend, but his campaign has insisted he's staying in the race. A Biden campaign email sent just this morning said, quote, "Joe Biden has made it more than clear. He's in this race and he's in it to win it. Moreover, he's the presumptive nominee. There is no plan for an alternative nominee. In a few short weeks, Joe Biden will be the official nominee." Not sure how many times you can get the words nominee into a brief sentence. Anyway, joining us now to discuss what she is hearing about Biden is Democratic strategist Nomiki Konst. So, Nomiki, what do you make of it all? Is he going to ultimately be the nominee or not?
And the signs are not looking great right now. Granted, there have been a lot of behind-the-scenes chatter. There have been unnamed sources that have heard conversations between Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and now former President Obama. But right now, I mean, obviously there are a lot of folks who have their agendas. They want to have Kamala Harris as the nominee. They want an open convention. They want a drag-out fight. They want to push Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro. People have their agendas. And oftentimes, not always, oftentimes those agendas are attached to jobs and contracts and money because presidential politics is a big game. But we don't have time. Right after the convention, within 90 days, we go into early voting. So I think ultimately the decision that has to be made, and this is really probably why it's taking 2 weeks, is whether or not Vice President Kamala Harris can put together a campaign, which is probably the easiest campaign to put together since she's on the same ticket as President Biden, in fast enough time and get those polls up. What is that campaign going to look like? How are they going to play that out at the convention without making people feel like it was undemocratic? These are probably the internal questions that are happening. But in conversations that I'm having with folks are frustrated that the Biden administration campaign are taking so long to decide. But I personally think that's because they need to keep their eye on those polls and see if it is truly a better bet to pass the baton on to Vice President Harris,
and
which is probably most likely. Just
briefly, Nomiki, because I know Nayara wants to get in here, but do you think they would be better changing nominee?
I think it would be nice to have a convention with many choices. We're battling time, but Dr. Jim Zogby, who served with me on the Unity Reform Commission, laid out a plan where you have these candidates run around the country for a series of a few weeks. They give rallies and speeches talking about the Democratic platform, fresh blood, fresh ideas, and then you have the convention. But we don't have that time now. We have a couple of weeks. That would have been the greatest plan. So now we have a situation in which President Biden's polls just keep sinking. The morale is very low. And I think it's time for him to step aside so we can move on to another candidate. I don't know if that next candidate is the right candidate, though. So this is a really difficult situation. We blame the DNC. I have to be very clear here. I mean, the DNC has rules in place. They had reforms that they were supposed to institute after 2016 that they did not, and it would have prevented a situation like this. The reason why they didn't institute them is because they really did want to have Vice President Biden become the presidential nominee in 2020. And maybe it is true that he was the only person that could have beaten Trump, but it doesn't mean that you suspend democracy, democratic systems in your own party to do so. And that's how we got to this point where everybody knew President Biden was 81 years old, had gaffes. I mean, it's a very grueling schedule. But if they weren't suspending any sort of debate and collaboration and real primary structure, then we wouldn't be in this situation, I truly believe, and we would have the strongest candidate to run against former President Trump.
Nomiki, you have expressed a lot of the frustration I felt too, which is that there are processes in place to have these kinds of conversations, and it's not a matter of, a couple of days before the convention, let's suddenly shake everything up because some billionaire donors realized what party activists and folks like yourself had known for quite some time. So bringing it back to your point, this is a DNC problem. Is part of their issue that they just are terrified of a convention that isn't as easy to predict and plot out every second, that is no longer about the show on stage and how it looks at TV, but is an actual discussion and family conversation.
Absolutely. In 2016, I personally was on the receiving end of this when I was with Bernie 2016 as a surrogate on the convention floor, on his platform and eventually his Unity Reform Commission committee. They wanted to shut down any sort of debate. They didn't want any sort of pushback on the platform. They had their delegates going in on the other side and said, on the platform committee, you vote for these things and you just vote for them. And they had their whips telling them to vote for them. But on our side, we actually deliberated and we had conversations. And we wanted to do that with the other side, the old guard of the Democratic Party. The problem is now, I truly believe the majority of the members, the elected members of the DNC, I truly believe that they do want these reforms. They do want change. They voted for them in 2018. The problem is they have this appointed committee at the top, not to get too wonky here, called the Rules Committee and the Executive Committee. They're appointed. They're not voted in, and they have more authority over the voting members of the DNC. And those members oftentimes are lobbyists and consultants and very big donors. So ultimately, what you just said was so correct. Is this about a bunch of billionaires in Los Angeles now frustrated that they're not going to give money to the Biden-Harris ticket and they're not going to give money to congressional candidates and Senate candidates? Yeah, that's what's making them freak out. But they should have been freaking out, I don't know, 8 years ago when we had this problem in 2016 and in 2008 when we had an earlier version between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. It's an institution, and the folks running the show that are not elected, the staff, they're institutionalists, and they don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to see change. They don't want to see reforms. And they've been giving the excuses that, well, we don't want to lose the money because we have to compete against Republicans. There's plenty of good money around there. This is basic good governance. We have gotten to a crisis, and it's a question of hubris at this point.
Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has, I think, surprised a lot of people on the outside of the DNC process by saying that folks aren't ready for what would really happen if you take that lid off the pot of Biden leaving and what that means for the party. And she's still saying that Biden should stay. Many of the other elected, the squad, the progressive members of Congress are thinking he should stay. And that there seems like a really big disconnect between how folks on the outside identify as what progressive should be and then the folks who are inside the party structure are advocating right now. Help us understand what is going on with progressives right now.
Well, I think, on domestic issues, and not all issues, President Biden has come across more progressive than we would have expected. Not everything, not ideal. I'm fully aware of that. But if you're a member of Congress and you're a progressive member of Congress, and you've built that relationship with the Biden administration, you want to stick with what you know. And I completely understand that from the perspective of wanting to get legislation passed, wanting to stay on your committees, wanting to have an open line with the White House. The alternative, you may not have that. So I see it from a congressional member's perspective, but that is not a campaign perspective. We're talking about beating this machine, this well-oiled Republican National Committee that's unified. You have folks that don't agree with Donald Trump now campaigning for Donald Trump, never Trumpers campaigning for Donald Trump because he's a Republican. You have a doubling down of the Project 2025 platform. You have J.D. Vance, who's being propped up and has been propped up by Peter Thiel, and Elon Musk, who's controlling a lot of this debate online, who's putting $25 million a month into the Republicans. So we can't take these chances right now. I really just think it's a reset at this point. I mean, do I think it would have been better if yes, like we had made this decision earlier? Absolutely. But now we're in a situation where it's on a downward decline, a rapidly downward decline in terms of morale, in terms of polling. And it would just give the Democrats a little bit of a boost to have another option, and hopefully a good option. Most likely going to be Vice President Harris. I don't think she would be my option, but I think that's the real likelihood, mainly just because of structural stuff. You have a campaign committee that she has to take over. You have to raise money. You have to do mailers, to do flyers. It has to make sense. If there was suddenly going to be 5 or 6 candidates at that convention, it would create a lot of chaos, and it would honestly would create a lot of backroom deals as well. That's just the history of the DNC.
Nomiki, just to drill back down onto the progressive side of this, because I do think it's legitimately very interesting. I mean, I understand the practical concerns about what happens if you replace Biden. There's kind of chaos. There's a very short period before the convention and all of that. But when one hears like AOC or Congresswoman Omar or others making the argument that is de facto support of Biden, it sometimes seems to me that they're sort of arguing, well, in the circumstances, he's the best that we can do. And that is tonally a very different argument than we're accustomed to hearing from progressives, which is typically, don't set the horizons too low, don't suggest that politics can only change sort of between A and B rather than A and Z. Does that not strike you as discordant that they're basically making that argument?
I think there's a reality in that we don't really have any cards right now at the table. They're making a decision based on their own needs and to be the best progressive Congress members for their districts and for the country. And if that means having an open line to President Biden, if that's the case, then so be it. That'll keep them in stronger positions. I'm arguing from a perspective of the Democratic Party is really about to screw up and not have an option, and the energy and the unity and frankly the money. I hate to say that these billionaires are holding us hostage, but they are. They're holding us hostage. They're pulling out their money for a nationwide campaign. Now, I can understand why AOC and Representative Ilhan Omar made this decision weeks ago. But now it is so clear that morale is so low and that the Biden campaign is being pushed up against the wall and the walls are closing in that I don't know how you can honestly stay with Biden at this point, other than the fact that you just want to keep the administration on course with what it's been campaigning on and keep working with them. But just say that. That's all. Just say that. Say why you're supporting them, because that's also a good argument. But the rest of the country that's on the Democratic side is afraid of what's going to happen, especially after Donald Trump's speech last night, that 90-minute long, love letter to Viktor Orban and Kim Jong-un and, the wildest members across the world. This is what I think so many Democrats are afraid of, and that's why morale is falling. So it's really about how do you boost the morale, and it might just be swapping out a candidate.
Well, to that point, though, I mean, what is the hope in terms of if President Biden remains determined to stay, and obviously, we all know the delegates and the primaries, blah, blah, blah. If he remains determined to stay, from your conversations, is the hope simply that by more Democrats coming forward publicly and saying they do want him to step aside, that the pressure will ultimately be irresistible and that his position will be basically untenable?
I think that's what's happening right now. I mean, 5 days ago, after Donald Trump was shot, I think folks thought maybe President Biden was the best option, that, okay, it's calmed down a little bit. He rode the storm out, which is what he usually does, and which is what a lot of Democrats are now doing, is they're riding out the controversy storms, the cancellation storms. They just ride it out and they end up on the other side. But that's not the case in this situation. Senator Schumer, I think when President Biden got COVID and he said that, hours before only a health situation would cause him to reassess, and then Senator Schumer called for him to step down, and then you're hearing rumblings of President Obama. I don't see a pathway out for him at this point. And that's why I believe, the New York Times and other publications have said he's probably going to make a decision, an open decision in the next couple of days. I just don't see it playing out well. It's just going to keep growing, and there's going to be more vocal, and you're going to be at the convention, and it's going to end up, I think they're going to push him at the convention to release his delegates to potentially another candidate. And then that's where it really gets messy, because you could have had a 2-week or 3-week conversation about who that next candidate was, whether it was going to be several candidates or whether it was going to be Kamala Harris. But at least it was preparation. If he waits all the way to the convention, it's going to be toxic. You're going to see the worst of the worst come out. They're going to be airing dirty laundry on television, which, of course, the Democrats never want to see or do. And it's only going to weaken us in terms of defeating the RNC right now and Trump.
Well, that is certainly what they should be looking to avoid. But we are quickly creeping our way to exactly that disaster, but possibly wildly entertaining convention that you're talking about, Nomiki. Thank you so much for joining us.
I've been on the other side of it. It's entertaining for you guys, but when you're in it and you're saying, okay, what cards do I have on the table? We as progressives right now don't have a lot. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but we don't have a progressive candidate. Kamala Harris is not our progressive hero. Joe Biden is as progressive as probably going to get at this point. We really have to be thinking about the next 4 years, the next 8 years. And so I'll leave you guys with that. Start planning now, start organizing now, start thinking of new platform ideas. We have some leverage here for the future.
Nomiki Konst, progressive